Welcome to the Veritas Brief, a podcast by Veritas Europaea, where we look at European politics through the lens of economics, markets, and power. Today we turn to Germany, and to a question that markets can no longer afford to ignore. What happens if the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, breaks through Germany's political firewall?
And this is no longer a theoretical question. According to the article we are discussing today, the AfD now leads national polling in Germany, stands at roughly 41% in Saxony-Anhalt, and could be in a position to govern a German state after the September 2026 election. That would be a historic break. It would also be a market event.
Exactly. For years, investors treated the AfD as a protest party. Dangerous, controversial, but politically contained. The assumption was simple. The party could gain votes, but it would not govern.
That assumption is now under pressure. And once investors have to price the possibility of AfD influence at state level, federal level, or even over EU policy, Germany's entire risk profile changes.
Let's begin with the core numbers. The article cites an AfD national polling average of around 27%. CDU/CSU stands near 23%. In Saxony-Anhalt, the AfD is around 41%. That means Germany's far-right party is not merely rising, it is, in some places, becoming dominant.
And Saxony-Anhalt matters because it could become the first German state where the AfD either leads a government or forces the mainstream parties into a nearly impossible coalition arrangement. For decades, German politics has relied on a cordon sanitaire, a firewall, that keeps the far right outside government. If that firewall cracks in one state, markets will ask whether it can crack elsewhere.
This is why the issue is not only political. Germany is Europe's largest economy. It anchors the Eurozone. German Bunds serve as the Euro area's benchmark safe asset. The DAX is deeply connected to global industry, exports, energy, banks, and manufacturing supply chains.
And Germany has always been priced by markets as a stability premium. Investors assume that Germany is predictable, institutionally disciplined, pro-European, and fiscally credible. The rise of the AfD challenges that premium.
The Veritas article makes an important point. The AfD's rise is not happening in a vacuum. It is linked to Germany's economic deterioration.
Yes, Germany has faced an unusual combination of problems: high energy prices, industrial stagnation, weak productivity, demographic pressure, underinvestment, excessive bureaucracy, and deep frustration in parts of Eastern Germany. The AfD has positioned itself at the intersection of those anxieties.
The German economy contracted in 2023 and 2024. Growth in 2025 was extremely weak, and the outlook for 2026 remains subdued. Germany, once seen as Europe's industrial engine, now looks increasingly like a stagnation story.
And that is politically explosive. When voters feel that the existing model no longer delivers prosperity, protest parties gain credibility. Even if their proposed solutions are risky, voters may still see them as the only actors willing to challenge the system.
So the AfD's message is powerful because it connects economic pain with political anger.
Exactly. The party tells voters that energy policy, migration, EU regulation, green transition costs, and the mainstream parties are responsible for Germany's decline. That message resonates strongly in places where people already feel economically abandoned.
Let's move to the AfD's economic platform. It is not a classic left-wing populist program. It combines nationalism with supply-side economics.
That is an important distinction. The AfD supports lower corporate taxes, lower income taxes, less regulation, less bureaucracy, and in many cases, lower inheritance tax. For parts of the Mittelstand, Germany's family-owned industrial backbone, that message has appeal.
German businesses often complain about high taxes, high labor costs, energy prices, and regulatory overload. So, on paper, parts of the AfD's platform sound business-friendly.
But the problem is arithmetic. You cannot cut taxes substantially, preserve Germany's social state, maintain the debt brake, and also fund defense, infrastructure, energy transition, and demographic costs. Something has to give.
The AfD supports a strict interpretation of the debt brake. It opposes large-scale fiscal loosening. But Germany needs investment in infrastructure, digitalization, defense, and industrial transformation.
That creates a contradiction. The party offers tax relief, but not a credible macro-fiscal framework for Germany's long-term investment needs.
Energy is one of the clearest parts of the AfD's economic message. The party wants to reverse Germany's energy transition, bring back nuclear power, support coal, and end subsidies for renewables.
This message works because Germany's energy costs are a real problem. Industrial electricity prices have damaged competitiveness, especially for chemicals, metals, glass, and other energy-intensive sectors. So when the AfD says that the Energiewende has made Germany less competitive, many business owners and workers listen.
But the article argues that the cure may be worse than the disease.
Yes, reversing Germany's energy transition would not instantly lower prices. Nuclear plants cannot simply be restarted overnight. Coal infrastructure has been partly dismantled or politically phased down. Renewable infrastructure has already absorbed hundreds of billions in investment. A sudden reversal could create stranded assets, legal disputes, investment paralysis, and major losses in green technology sectors.
So energy policy is a double-edged sword. It could appeal to distressed industry, but it could also create another shock to capital allocation.
Precisely. It may help the AfD politically, but it may not solve the competitiveness problem quickly. It could even intensify uncertainty for utilities, renewable developers, grid investors, and industrial firms planning long-term energy contracts.
The most severe risk in the article is Dexit, Germany leaving the European Union or the Eurozone.
And this is the issue that turns the AfD from a domestic political story into a systemic European risk. The AfD has described the EU as a failed project. Senior figures have refused to rule out leaving the EU or the Euro. Even if the party is internally divided, markets do not need certainty to react. They react to probability.
The article cites Berenberg's estimate that Dexit could cost Germany more than 10% of GDP over a decade. That is an enormous number.
If Germany's GDP is around 4.2 trillion euros, a 10% loss represents roughly 420 billion euros in lost output. The article also cites estimates that as many as 2.2 million jobs could be at risk in a German EU exit scenario.
And the article argues that Dexit would likely be worse than Brexit.
Yes, because Germany is much more deeply integrated into the EU's industrial supply chains. Britain never used the euro. Germany does. Britain's manufacturing supply chains were important, but Germany's are central to the European production system. German cars, machinery, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and industrial components depend on frictionless trade across EU borders.
So a German exit would not simply be a legal or political event. It would be a supply chain event, a currency event, a banking event, and a sovereign risk event.
Exactly. The Eurozone was built around Germany's credibility. If Germany itself became the source of Euro uncertainty, the shock would be existential.
Let's discuss markets. What happens if the AfD enters a state government?
The first reaction would likely be repricing. Markets currently assume that the AfD remains excluded from power. If that assumption breaks, investors would reassess German political risk. The euro could weaken. German Bund yields could move higher. Sensitive DAX sectors could sell off. Banks and exporters would likely face the strongest questions.
German bonds are especially important. They are treated as the Eurozone's safest asset.
Yes, if investors begin to question Germany's political stability, fiscal direction, or commitment to European integration, the Bunds' safe haven status does not disappear overnight, but it becomes less absolute. A widening spread between German bonds and euro swaps would signal that investors are demanding a higher risk premium.
And what about the DAX?
The DAX would not react uniformly. Some sectors might initially benefit from AfD policies. Conventional energy could benefit from a reversal of green policy. Defense could benefit from continued security spending, although AfD's foreign policy positioning complicates that. But renewable energy, banks, automotive manufacturers, and export-oriented industrials would face serious risks.
The automotive sector is especially interesting. The AfD opposes the EU's 2035 combustion engine ban, which might sound positive for BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen.
But that benefit is limited if the same political agenda threatens the European single market. German car makers depend heavily on EU supply chains and EU consumers. A weaker single market would likely hurt them more than regulatory relief would help them.
The euro is another key issue. What does AfD influence mean for the currency?
The euro would likely come under pressure if markets believed that Dexit had become more plausible. The immediate move would depend on the political event. State government participation would cause concern. Federal government participation would be much more serious. The real fear is redenomination risk.
Explain that.
Redenomination risk means investors begin to ask whether euro-denominated German assets could one day be converted into a new Deutschmark or another national currency. That possibility sounds remote. But if a party advocating EU or euro exit enters government, even a small probability can have large consequences.
Because investors do not wait for the actual exit. They reprice when the probability changes.
Exactly. Markets move on expectations. If investors see a path from AfD state power to federal influence to Eurozone confrontation, they price that path before it happens.
The central political question is whether the firewall holds.
In Saxony-Anhalt, the numbers make that difficult. The article says the incumbent CDU-SP-DFDP coalition may fall short of a majority. The Greens and BSW risk falling below the 5% threshold. That leaves only a few viable combinations.
One option is a highly unusual CDU-link arrangement. Another is new elections. Another is some kind of cooperation with the AfD.
And if the CDU formally cooperates with the AfD in a German state, it changes the national political landscape. It tells voters, parties, and investors that AfD exclusion is no longer guaranteed.
That is why a state election can become a European market event.
Yes, Saxony-Anhalt may not be Germany's largest state, but symbolically, it could be decisive. It could become the first visible crack in the post-war political barrier against the far right.
The article outlines 3 scenarios. Let's go through them. Scenario A. The firewall holds.
In that case, the CDU finds a way to govern without the AfD, perhaps through minority arrangements or difficult parliamentary support. Markets would likely feel relief. The DAX would remain broadly stable. Bunds would stay anchored. The euro might see a mild relief rally, but the political cost would still be high. The AfD could claim that the establishment is forming unnatural alliances to keep it out.
Scenario B. A state-level breach.
This is the crucial scenario. The AfD enters government in one or more Eastern German states. It gains administrative credibility. It gains Bundesrat influence. It becomes harder for national parties to argue that cooperation is impossible. Markets would likely treat this as the beginning of a new phase. The DAX could suffer a sector-specific sell-off. Bund spreads could widen. The euro could weaken by a few percentage points if investors see broader implications.
Scenario C. Federal breakthrough in 2029.
This is the systemic risk scenario. If the AfD enters federal government, Dexit moves from rhetoric to policy debate. Eurozone cohesion comes under pressure. Redenomination risk returns. Investors remember the Eurozone crisis, but this time Germany, not Greece or Italy, would be the source of uncertainty. That would be a fundamentally different crisis.
The article ends with a strong argument. The AfD does not need to govern to influence the economy.
That may be the most important point. Even without power, the AfD shifts the policy debate. It pushes mainstream parties toward more nationalist, more protectionist, more migration-restrictive positions. That can damage Germany's long-term growth model.
Because Germany needs skilled migration, infrastructure investment, deeper European integration, and faster industrial adaptation.
Exactly. But the AfD's rise makes those policies politically harder. It pressures the CDU and other parties to adopt positions that may win votes, but weaken the economic reform agenda.
So the AfD's economic impact begins before it enters government.
Yes, political pressure itself has an economic cost. It changes expectations, delays investment, narrows policy options, and increases uncertainty.
So what should investors, policymakers, and European observers watch?
First, Saxony-Anhalt. If the AfD breaks into state government there, the firewall assumption changes. Second, CDU behavior. If the CDU starts normalizing cooperation with the AfD, markets will treat that as a major signal. Third, the Bundesrat. State-level AfD power could affect federal fiscal reforms, especially around the debt brake. Fourth, the euro debate. Any move from rhetorical Euroscepticism toward concrete Dexit policy would be a red flag.
And the final takeaway?
The AfD is not just a political risk. It is a macroeconomic risk, a market risk, and a European integration risk. Germany's economic weakness fuels the party's rise, but the party's policy agenda could deepen the very weaknesses that created its opportunity.
That is the paradox at the center of this story. Germany remains the anchor of Europe, but if that anchor starts to move, the entire European vessel shifts with it. This was the Veritas Brief by Veritas Europaea. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, and see you next time.